In the ancient world, few names inspired as much awe and terror as Sparta, the city that turned war into worship. Its warriors were legends, its discipline unmatched. But beneath the bronze helmets and crimson cloaks lay a truth that history rarely speaks aloud. Sparta ruled not by courage alone, but by fear. To defy the state was to vanish into silence. There were no trials, no mercy, no graves. Only the whisper of your name as you disappeared into the dark. For Sparta had perfected the art of killing not in battle but in punishment. The weak were cast from cliffs. The rebellious were hunted in the night. The disobedient were whipped until their hearts stopped. And even kings, the very rulers of the city, could be starved to death behind temple walls. To the outside world, these were the heroes of Thermopylae. To those who lived under their rule, they were gods of iron demanding obedience, purity, and absolute control. This is the hidden story of Sparta's execution methods, the laws of death that kept an empire alive, and the cruelty that proved even the mightiest city can go too far, just beyond the city walls of Sparta. Beneath the shadow of Mount Taygetus there yawns a dark wound in the earth, a jagged gorge known as the Kaiadas. To the Spartans it was not merely a pit. It was a tool of purification, the city's coldest law made flesh. Here the condemned met their end without ritual, without prayer, without sound. The Kaiadas was where Sparta threw away imperfection. According to ancient accounts, infants deemed weak, malformed, or sickly were carried by state elders to the cliff's edge. Their bodies were weighed by judgment, their worth decided not by birth but by potential. If the child's limbs trembled or its cry sounded frail, the verdict was silent but final: it would not serve Sparta. Then came the fall. A single motion, a child cast into darkness, and the city went on, untouched, unflinching. But the Kaiadas did not devour only infants. Archaeological discoveries centuries later would reveal adult remains in that same pit, skulls fractured, bones scarred by violence and starvation. These were no ritual burials. They were executions. Traitors captured helots, Sparta's enslaved class, and citizens accused of dishonor were hurled alive into the abyss. There were no trials, no witnesses, no tombs. The city erased them with the same efficiency it forged its warriors. Once thrown in, there was no return. The pit's walls were sheer, its bottom littered with jagged stone. Death came fast for some, slowly for others. A shattered spine, a fractured skull, or days of agony beneath the open sky. No family was permitted to mourn. To grieve a condemned man was to challenge the judgment of the state. The Kaiadas thus became more than a place of death. It was a message carved into the land itself. Sparta has no room for weakness, nor forgiveness for defiance. Foreigners found it monstrous. To the Spartans it was justice. They believed that by casting out impurity they preserved their divine order. The cliff became sacred ground not for the gods but for their own cruel perfection. Even centuries later, the echoes of the Kaiadas endured. Roman travelers who ventured near spoke of an eerie silence, a place where birds would not nest and travelers dared not linger after sunset. It was said the wind carried whispers, voices calling from the pit, remnants of the condemned. But Sparta had no use for ghosts. To them the Kaiadas was a clean wound, a necessary cruelty that ensured only the strong survived. And yet this was only the beginning. For Sparta's mastery of death did not end with the fall. It evolved into something colder, quieter, and far more deliberate. When the sun set over the mountains of Laconia, Sparta's true terror began. By day, the city was all order, shining armor, marching soldiers, the rhythm of discipline. But by night the law changed. Shadows moved through the fields, silent and unseen, carrying daggers instead of shields. These were the men of the Krypteia, Sparta's secret executioners. Chosen from the strongest and most disciplined of the young warriors, the Krypteia were both feared and revered. Officially, they were part of a sacred test of endurance, a rite of passage to prove courage. In truth, they were the state's invisible blade, unleashed to control the enslaved helot population through fear and death every year. The Spartan ephors, the ruling magistrates, declared formal war on the Helots. This decree was not metaphorical. It was a legal act that allowed the Krypteia to kill without trial, without guilt, without sin. For as long as the ritual war lasted, every Helot was fair game. Armed only with knives, the young Spartans were sent into the countryside. They traveled barefoot, without fire, hiding during the day and striking by night. Their orders were simple: eliminate any Helot who appeared strong, defiant, or capable of leadership. It was not war. It was extermination. Victims were chosen carefully. A Helot who stood too tall, who spoke too proudly, or who was seen gathering others, that was enough. His death would come without warning, a whisper, a glint of steel, and silence. Bodies were left in the dirt or disappeared altogether. The message was unmistakable. Strength was rebellion. For the Krypteia, this was both training and terror. Each killing hardened them, stripping away fear, pity, and hesitation. They learned to move without sound, to kill without question, to vanish without trace. In the eyes of the state, the young men who returned were purified, forged by blood and obedience. But for the Helots, the Krypteia was a nightmare that never slept. Farmers whispered of footsteps in the dark, of friends who vanished between one sunset and the next. No one knew when the next strike would come, and that was the point. The terror kept them obedient. The silence kept them broken. Even ancient historians like Plutarch wrote of the Krypteia with unease, calling it a declaration of war upon the enslaved. Yet for the Spartans, it was necessary, the unseen hand that kept their empire from collapse. In Sparta, death was not chaos. It was order. And the Krypteia were its guardians, proof that the city's greatest weapon was not the sword, but fear itself. At the heart of Sparta stood a temple, not to love or mercy, but to pain. It was the sanctuary of Artemis, a place where blood was both offering and lesson. Every year the city gathered there in celebration, not of victory, but of endurance. And for the young, it was the day when the state decided who among them was truly Spartan. Rows of boys, some no older than 12, stood before the altar. In their eyes flickered the fear they were forbidden to show. Behind them crowds assembled, elders, mothers, even visiting foreigners who came to witness the spectacle that made Sparta infamous. At a signal from the priests, the ritual began. The boys were commanded to steal cheese from the altar of the goddess, a symbolic act of defiance. But as they reached for it, men armed with whips stepped forward. Lashes cracked through the air like lightning, striking flesh, tearing skin. The temple echoed with the sound of leather meeting bone again and again, until blood ran down the steps like rain. It was called the Diamastagosis, the contest of whips. In theory, it was not an execution. It was a trial of endurance. The goal was to withstand pain without flinching, to show devotion to discipline above all else. But in practice, death came often. Plutarch writes of boys who refused to cry out even as they collapsed, their bodies torn open, their hearts stopping mid-beat. When they died, they were not pitied, they were celebrated. Their corpses were proof that the Spartan spirit was unbroken. For the survivors, the scars were lifelong badges of honor. For the dead, their silence became legend. This ritual was more than spectacle, it was indoctrination. The boys were learning the same lesson their fathers lived by, that pain was not punishment, but purification. To feel it was to grow closer to the gods, to prove one's worth to the city. And the whips did not fall only on children. Adults, too, faced public lashings. Soldiers accused of cowardice, citizens who disobeyed the laws, or slaves who showed defiance, all could be tied to the post and whipped until blood and dust mixed beneath their feet. For the Helots, these punishments were constant reminders of their place. Sometimes they were beaten not for rebellion, but for nothing at all, a warning to others. In Sparta, even cruelty had order. Every blow had purpose, every death a meaning. The lash was not merely a weapon, it was the voice of the city, commanding obedience through agony. To outsiders, it seemed barbaric. To the Spartans, it was divine. They believed pain was the foundation of strength, and those who survived it became unbreakable. But as the altar drank its fill year after year, few dared ask how much humanity was left in a people who worshipped suffering. For a city built on the glory of battle, Sparta had another, quieter way of killing, one that required no blood, no spectacle, no sound. It was the punishment reserved for those whose crimes were too sacred, too political, or too shameful to be met with steel. They called it the death of silence. When a citizen or ruler was accused of treason, sacrilege, or betrayal, Sparta did not always execute them in public. Instead, they were sealed away, walled inside chambers, or buried alive in underground pits, left to die not by the sword, but by starvation and solitude. This was not neglect, it was design. The condemned were placed in stone enclosures or natural caves near the temples or city outskirts. The entrance was sealed with timber or rocks, shutting out the light. There was no ceremony, no prayer, only the faint sound of stones being stacked, a tomb built around a living body. First came the disbelief, then thirst, then hunger. The air grew thin, the body weak. Days blurred into hallucinations, until the voice that once defied Sparta fell silent forever. This was the fate of King Pausanias, one of Sparta's greatest generals, the hero of Plataea, who helped defeat the Persians. When accused of treason, he sought refuge inside a temple, trusting that the sanctity of the gods would protect him. But the Ephors, the city's rulers, did not dare spill royal blood upon holy ground, so they walled him inside. They left him there, trapped between the divine and the damned, until hunger took his strength and silence took his breath. When they finally opened the temple days later, he was already dead. Sparta's chroniclers claimed this was justice, not vengeance. Yet even they recorded how the act stained the temple forever, a place once sacred now haunted by the crime of the state. But Pausanias was not the only one to die this way. Records tell of traitors, captured enemies, and disgraced citizens who were confined underground, stripped of dignity, denied an honorable death. For the Spartans, starvation was the ultimate form of control. It required patience, not passion. It turned death into ritual and made the condemned participate in their own punishment. Unlike the cliff of Kaiadas or the lash at Artemis, there were no witnesses here. Only darkness, only the slow decay of body and mind. The symbolism was deliberate. To be starved to death was to be erased, to vanish so completely that even your death left no mark. The state didn't have to kill you. It simply stopped acknowledging that you existed. To the Spartans, this method was pure, a punishment untouched by rage. To the rest of the world, it was monstrous. Even their allies recoiled from the coldness of it. Yet within Sparta's rigid code, it made sense. A people who believed that mercy was weakness could not allow death to come with compassion. Here, even in death, the condemned served the city's creed: silence, obedience, and the supremacy of the state. Sparta had perfected every form of punishment: the fall, the blade, the lash, and now the void. And in mastering death, it forgot that life was ever sacred. Part 5, the law of fear in Sparta. Death was not chaos. It was order, the invisible thread that held the city together. Every citizen knew the rules. Obedience was life, hesitation was danger, and defiance was death. The Spartans did not need gallows or prisons. Their punishments were not designed merely to kill the body, they were made to control the soul. The fear began in childhood. Every Spartan boy grew up beneath the shadow of the Kaiadas, that dark pit waiting for the unworthy. Every girl was raised to watch her brothers whipped, to hear the screams fade into silence and call it virtue. The lesson was burned into their bones before they could speak. Pain is the price of belonging. The city did not rule through numbers or wealth, it ruled through discipline, through terror made sacred. When a citizen watched a traitor hurled into the abyss, or saw a boy bleed to death at Artemis, they were not meant to feel horror. They were meant to feel peace, reassurance that the laws still held, that weakness had been cleansed. The Krypteia stalked the fields at night, ensuring the slaves remembered their place. The public whippings reminded the citizens that even the purest blood could be spilled by the city's hand. The starvation pits warned the kings themselves that no one, not even royalty, stood above the law. And so obedience became worship, fear became faith. Foreigners visiting Sparta were astonished by the calm of its people, the way they spoke softly, moved in unison, never argued, never wept. To them it was discipline. To the Spartans it was survival. They had learned to live without questions, to breathe without defiance. The entire city was one heartbeat, steady, strong, and utterly silent, but there was a cost. The more the state demanded perfection, the fewer remained to serve it. The rigid system that once forged warriors began to consume itself. Each war, each ritual, each execution drained Sparta of life, citizens killed in battle, children lost to the Kaiadas, slaves slaughtered in secret. The city that once overflowed with strength began to wither in numbers and spirit. The people could no longer distinguish between justice and fear, between discipline and death. The very laws that made Sparta invincible were hollowing it from within. And yet they endured, because to question the law was to betray it. To doubt Sparta was to die by it. Through generations, the city survived not through love or freedom, but through the discipline of fear. It was a perfection that could not evolve, a machine that could only run until it broke. Sparta's strength had become its own executioner. For centuries, Sparta stood like a blade against the world, sharp, cold, and unbending. Its warriors were legends, its discipline unmatched. Yet beneath the iron calm, cracks had begun to form. The same laws that made Sparta invincible were quietly killing it from within. The obsession with strength had reduced its people to a fragile few. Each war demanded the lives of the best, while the weak were destroyed before they could even grow. By the time the rest of Greece began to flourish, Athens in art, Thebes in strategy, Macedon in ambition, Sparta was running out of blood. Its perfect society had become a dwindling echo. Still, the Spartans refused to change. Their laws were sacred, their traditions untouchable. To question them was to defy the ghost of Lycurgus, their mythical lawgiver, whose word was considered divine. They would rather die pure than live altered, and die they did. The first blow came at Leuctra in 371 BCE. The Theban general Epaminondas, with new tactics and fresh soldiers, shattered the Spartan phalanx, the formation once thought unbeatable. The elite warriors, trained from birth, fell one after another. For the first time in history, the invincible had been broken. In the years that followed, Sparta never recovered. Its population collapsed. Its once mighty army was reduced to a handful of aging men still clinging to the glory of Thermopylae. The Helots, the enslaved backbone of the state, rose in rebellion. The fields that had once fed the city were soaked in the blood of masters and slaves alike. The city tried to restore order through the same methods it always had: more whippings, more executions, more fear. But fear no longer worked. The people had grown numb to pain, indifferent to death. The terror that once united them now only reminded them of what they had lost: freedom, hope, and the will to live. When outsiders came, they found a city that looked the same but felt hollow. The barracks still stood, the temples still gleamed, but the spirit that had once burned in every Spartan heart was gone. The iron had rusted. In time, Sparta became a curiosity, a relic of another age. Roman travelers came to watch its rituals as though they were theater. The whippings at Artemis Orthia became spectacles for tourists, not ceremonies of faith. The once sacred symbols of discipline turned into performances for coin. The city that had built itself on perfection had been reduced to memory, a warning written in blood and stone. Its fall was not a conquest by enemies, but by its own ideals. Sparta had bred out weakness, but in doing so it had also bred out compassion, innovation, and growth. It forgot that survival is not about strength alone, it's about change. And so the Iron City, forged in pain and pride, was buried not by foreign swords, but by time itself. The wind still moves through its ruins, whispering over the stones that once echoed with war songs and cries of endurance. But now the silence carries a different message, not of obedience, but of regret.